clauses are never applied. On the other hand, a secret organization of this kind, with its central group in each factory, makes it very easy for the gendarmes to carry out raids on a vast scale. The Polish comrades have passed through a similar phase in their movement, with everybody enthusiastic about the extensive organization of workers' benefit funds. But they very quickly abandoned this idea when they saw that such organizations only provided rich harvests for the gendarmes. If we have in mind broad workers' organizations and not widespread arrests, if we do not want to provide satisfaction to the gendarmes, we must see to it that these organizations remain without any rigid formal structure. But will they be able to function in that case? Let us see what the functions are. Quote, to observe all that goes on in the factory and keep a record of events. Paragraph 2 of the rules. Do we really require a formally established group for this purpose? Could not the purpose be better served by correspondence conducted in the illegal papers without the setting up of special groups? Quote, to lead the struggles of the workers for the improvement of their workshop conditions, unquote. Paragraph 3. This too requires no set organizational form. Any sensible agitator can, in the course of ordinary conversation, gather what the demands of the workers are and transmit them to a narrow, not a broad, organization of revolutionaries for expression in a leaflet. Quote, to organize a fund to which subscriptions of 2 kopecks per ruble of wages earned should be made, unquote. Paragraph 9. And then to present themselves to subscribers a monthly financial account, paragraph 17, to expel members who fail to pay their contributions, paragraph 10, and so forth. Why, this is a very paradise for the police, for nothing would be easier for them than to penetrate into such a secrecy of a, quote, central factory fund, confiscate the money, and arrest the best people. Would it not be simpler to issue 1 kopeck or 2 kopeck coupons bearing the official stamp of a well-known, very narrow, and very secret organization, or to make collections without coupons of any kind and to print reports in a certain agreed code in an illegal paper? The object would thereby be attained, but it would be 100 times more difficult for the gendarmes to pick up clues. I could go on analyzing the rules, but I think that what has been said will suffice. A small, compact corps of the most reliable, experienced, and hardened workers, with responsible representatives in the principal districts and connected by all the rules of strict secrecy with the organization of revolutionaries, can, with the widest support of the masses and without any formal organization, perform all the functions of a trade union organization in a manner, moreover, desirable to social democracy. Only in this way can we secure the consolidation and development of a social democratic trade union movement, despite all the gendarmes. It may be objected that an organization which is so loose that it is not even definitely formed and which has not even an enrolled and registered membership cannot be called an organization at all. Perhaps so. Not the name that is important. What is important is that this, quote, organization without members shall do everything that is required and from the very outset ensure a solid connection between our future trade unions and socialism. Only an incorrigible utopian would have a broad organization of workers with elections, reports, universal suffrage, etc. under the autocracy. The moral to be drawn from this is simple. If we begin with the solid foundation of a strong organization of revolutionaries, we can ensure the stability of the movement as a whole and carry out the aims both of social democracy and of trade unions proper. If, however, we begin with a broad workers' organization, which is supposedly most, quote, accessible to the masses, but which is actually most accessible to the gendarmes and makes revolutionaries most accessible to the police, we shall achieve neither the one aim nor the other. We shall not eliminate our rule of thumb methods, and because we remain scattered and our forces are constantly broken up by the police, we shall only make trade unions of the Zubetov and Ozerov type the more accessible to the masses. What, properly speaking, should be the functions of the organization of revolutionaries? We shall deal with this question in detail. First, however, let us examine a very typical argument advanced by our terrorist, who, sad fate, in this matter also is a next-door neighbor to The Economist. Svoboda, a journal published for workers, contains in its first issue an article entitled Organization, the author of which tries to defend his friends, the economist workers of Ivanovo-Voznesensk. He writes, quote, "It is bad when the masses are mute and unenlightened, when the movement does not come from the rank and file. For instance, the students of a university town leave for their homes during the summer and other holidays, and immediately the workers' movement comes to a standstill. Can a workers' movement, which has to be pushed on from outside, be a real force? No, indeed, it has not yet learned to walk. It is still in leading strings. So it is in all matters. The students go off, and everything comes to a standstill. The most capable are seized, the cream is skimmed, and the milk turns sour. If the, quote, committee is arrested, everything comes to a standstill until a new one can be formed, and one never knows what sort of committee will be set up next. It may be nothing like the former. The first said one thing, the second may say the very opposite. Continuity between yesterday and tomorrow is broken. The experience of the past does not serve as a guide for the future. And all because no roots have been struck in depth, in the masses. The work is carried on not by 100 fools, but by a dozen wise men. A dozen wise men can be wiped out at a snap, but when the organization embraces masses, everything proceeds from them, and nobody, however he tries, can wreck the cause," unquote. The facts are described correctly. The picture of our amateurism is well drawn, but the conclusions are worthy of Rabotchia Missile, both as regards their stupidity and their lack of political tact. They represent the height of stupidity because the author confuses the philosophical and social historical question of the, quote, depth of the, quote, roots of the movement with the technical and organizational question of the best method in combating the gendarmes. They represent the height of political tactlessness because instead of appealing from bad leaders to good leaders, the author appeals from the leaders in general to the, quote, masses. This is as much an attempt to drag us back organizationally as the idea of substituting excitative terrorism for political agitation drags us back politically. Indeed, I am experiencing a veritable embarrassment of riches and hardly know where to begin to disentangle the jumble offered up by Svoboda. For clarity, let me begin by citing an example. Take the Germans. It will not be denied, I hope, that theirs is a mass organization, that in Germany everything proceeds from the masses, that the working class movement there has learned to walk. Yet observe how these millions value their, quote, dozen tried political leaders, how firmly they cling to them. Members of the hostile parties in parliament have often taunted the socialists by exclaiming, quote, "Fine Democrats you are indeed. Yours is a working class movement only in name. In actual fact, the clique of leaders is always in evidence. The same Babel and the same Liebknecht, year in and year out, and that goes on for decades. Your supposedly elected workers' deputies are more permanent than the officials appointed by the emperor, but the Germans only smile with contempt at these demagogic attempts to set the, quote, masses against the, quote, leaders, to arouse bad and ambitious instincts in the former, and to rob the movement of its solidity and stability by undermining the confidence of the masses in their, quote, dozen wise men. Political thinking is sufficiently developed among the Germans, and they have accumulated sufficient political experience to understand that without the, quote, dozen tried and talented leaders, and talented men are not born by the hundreds, professionally trained, schooled by long experience, and working in perfect harmony, no class in modern society can wage a determined struggle. The Germans, too, have had demagogues in their ranks who have flattered the, quote, 100 fools, exalted them above the, quote, dozen wise men, extolled the, quote, horny hand of the masses, and, like Most and Hasselmann, have spurred them on to reckless, quote, revolutionary action, and sown distrust toward the firm and steadfast leaders. It was only by stubbornly and relentlessly combating all demagogic elements within the socialist movement that German socialism has managed to grow and become as strong as it is. Our wiseacres, however, at a time when Russian social democracy is passing through a crisis entirely due to the lack of sufficiently trained, developed, and experienced leaders to guide the spontaneously awakening masses, cry out with the profundity of fools, quote, "It is a bad business when the movement does not proceed from the rank and file," unquote. Quote, "A committee of students is no use. It is not stable. unquote. Quite true. But the conclusion to be drawn from this is that we must have a committee of professional revolutionaries, and it is immaterial whether a student or a worker is capable of becoming a professional revolutionary. The conclusion you draw, however, is that the working class movement must not be pushed on from outside. In your political innocence, you fail to notice that you are playing into the hands of our economists and fostering our amateurism. Wherein, may I ask, did our students, quote, push on our workers? In the sense that the student brought to the worker the fragments of political knowledge he himself possesses, the crumbs of socialist ideas he has managed to acquire. For the principal intellectual diet of the present-day student, legal Marxism could furnish only the rudiments, only scraps of knowledge. There has never been too much of such pushing on from outside. On the contrary, there has so far been all too little of it in our movement, for we've been stewing too assiduously in our own juice. We have bowed far too slavishly to the elementary, quote, economic struggle of the workers against the employers and the government. We professional revolutionaries must and will make it our business to engage in this kind of, quote, pushing on 100 times more forcibly than we have done hitherto. But the very fact that you select so hideous a phrase as, quote, pushing on from outside, a phrase which cannot but rouse in the workers, at least in the workers who are as unenlightened as you yourselves, a sense of distrust toward all who bring them political knowledge and revolutionary experience from outside, which cannot but rouse in them an instinctive desire to resist all such people, proves you to be demagogues, and demagogues are the worst enemies of the working class. And please don't hasten howling about my, quote, uncomradely methods of debating. I have not the least desire to doubt the purity of your intentions. As I have said, one may become a demagogue out of sheer political innocence. But I have shown that you have descended to demagogy, and I will never tire of repeating that demagogues are the worst enemies of the working class. The worst enemies because they arouse base instincts in the masses, because the unenlightened worker is unable to recognize his enemies in men who represent themselves, and sometimes sincerely so, as his friends. The worst enemies because in the period of disunity and vacillation, when our movement is just beginning to take shape, nothing is easier to employ than demagogic methods to mislead the masses, who can realize their error only later by bitter experience. That is why the slogan of the day for the Russian Social Democrat must be resolute struggle against Svoboda and Rabochye Dyelo, both of which have sunk to the level of demagogy. We shall deal with this further in greater detail. Quote, a dozen wise men can be more easily wiped out than 100 fools, unquote. This wonderful truth, for which the 100 fools will always applaud you, appears obvious only because in the very midst of the argument you have skipped from one question to another. You began by talking and continued to talk of the unearthing of a, quote, committee, of the unearthing of a organization, and now you skip to the question of unearthing the movement's, quote, roots in their, quote, depths. The fact is, of course, that our movement cannot be unearthed for the very reason that it has countless thousands of roots deep down among the masses. But that is not the point at issue. As far as, quote, deep roots are concerned, we cannot be, quote, unearthed, even now, despite all our amateurism, and yet we all complain, and cannot but complain, that the, quote, organizations are being unearthed, and as a result, it is impossible to maintain continuity in the movement. But since you raised the question of organizations being unearthed, and persist in your opinion, I assert that it is far more difficult to unearth a dozen wise men than 100 fools. This position I will defend no matter how much you instigate the masses against me for my, quote, anti-democratic views, etc. As I have stated repeatedly, by, quote, wise men in connection with organization, I mean professional revolutionaries, irrespective of whether they have developed from among students or working men. I assert, 1, that no revolutionary movement can endure without a stable organization of leaders maintaining continuity. 2, that the broader the popular mass drawn spontaneously into the struggle, which forms the basis of the movement and participates in it, the more urgent the need for such organization, and the more solid this organization must be, for it is much easier for all sorts of demagogues to sidetrack the more backward sections of the masses. 3, that such an organization must consist chiefly of people professionally engaged in revolutionary activity. 4, that in an autocratic state, the more we confine the membership of such an organization to people who are professionally engaged in revolutionary activity and who have been professionally trained in the art of combating the political police, the more difficult will it be to unearth the organization. And 5, the greater will be the number of people from the working class and from the other social classes who will be able to join the movement and perform active work in it. I invite our economists, terrorists, and economist-terrorists to confute these propositions. At the moment, I shall deal only with the last 2 points. The question as to whether it is easier to wipe out, quote, a dozen wise men or, quote, 100 fools, reduces itself to the question above considered, whether it is possible to have a mass organization when the maintenance of strict secrecy is essential. We can never give a mass organization that degree of secrecy without which there can be no question of persistent and continuous struggle against the government. To concentrate all secret functions in the hands of as small a number of professional revolutionaries as possible does not mean that the latter will, quote, do the thinking for all, and that the rank and file will not take an active part in the movement. On the contrary, the membership will promote increasing numbers of the professional revolutionaries from its ranks, for it will know that it is not enough for a few students and for a few working men waging the economic struggle to gather in order to form a committee, but that it takes years to train oneself to be a professional revolutionary, and the rank and file will think not only of amateurish methods, but of such training. Centralization of the secret functions of the organization by no means implies centralization of all the functions of the movement. Active participation of the widest masses in the illegal press will not diminish because a, quote, dozen professional revolutionaries centralize the secret functions connected with this work. On the contrary, it will increase tenfold. In this way, and in this way alone, shall we ensure that reading the illegal press, writing for it, and to some extent even distributing it, will almost cease to be secret work, for the police will soon come to realize the folly and impossibility of judicial and administrative red tape procedure over every copy of a publication that is being distributed in the thousands. This holds not only for the press, but for every function of the movement, even for demonstrations. The active and widespread participation of the masses will not suffer. On the contrary, it will benefit by the fact that a dozen experienced revolutionaries, trained professionally no less than the police, will centralize all the secret aspects of the work, the drawing up of leaflets, the working out of approximate plans, and the appointing of bodies of leaders for each urban district, for each institution, etc. I know that exception will be taken to my, quote, undemocratic views, but I shall reply below fully to this anything but intelligent objection. Centralization of the most secret functions in an organization of revolutionaries will not diminish, but rather increase the extent and enhance the quality of the activity of a large number of other organizations that are intended for a broad public, and are therefore as loose and as non-secret as possible, such as workers' trade unions, workers' self-education circles, and circles for reading illegal literature, and socialist as well as democratic circles among all other sections of the population, etc., etc. We must have such circles, trade unions, and organizations everywhere in as large a number as possible, and with the widest variety of functions, but it would be absurd and harmful to confound them with the organization of revolutionaries, to efface the borderline between them, to make still more hazy the all too faint recognition of the fact that in order to, quote, serve the mass movement, we must have people who will devote themselves exclusively to social democratic activities, and that such people must train themselves patiently and steadfastly to be professional revolutionaries. Yes, this recognition is incredibly dim. Our worst sin with regard to organization consists in the fact that by our primitiveness, we have lowered the prestige of revolutionaries in Russia. A person who is flabby and shaky on questions of theory, who has a narrow outlook, who pleads the spontaneity of the masses as an excuse for his own sluggishness, who resembles a trade union secretary more than a spokesman of the people, who is unable to conceive of a broad and bold plan that would command the respect even of opponents, and who is inexperienced and clumsy in his own professional art, the art of combating the political police. Such a man is not a revolutionary, but a wretched amateur. Let no active worker take offense at these frank remarks, for as far as insufficient training is concerned, I apply them first and foremost to myself. I used to work in a study circle that set itself very broad, all-embracing tasks, and all of us, members of that circle, suffered painfully and acutely from the realization that we were acting as amateurs at a moment in history when we might have been able to say, bearing a well-known statement, quote, "Give us an organization of revolutionaries and we will overturn Russia." The more I recall the burning sense of shame I then experienced, the bitterer became my feelings toward those pseudo-social democrats whose preachings, quote, "bring disgrace on the calling of a revolutionary," who failed to understand that our task is not to champion the degrading of the revolutionary to the level of an amateur, but to raise the amateurs to the level of revolutionaries. Section 4.4, the scope of organizational work. We have heard BV tell us about, quote, the lack of revolutionary forces fit for action, which is felt not only in St. Petersburg, but throughout Russia, unquote. Hardly anyone will dispute this fact, but the question is, how is it to be explained? BV writes, quote, "We shall not go into an explanation of the historical causes of this phenomenon. We shall merely state that a society, demoralized by prolonged political reaction and split by past and present economic changes, promotes from its own ranks an extremely small number of persons fit for revolutionary work, that the working class does produce revolutionary workers who to some extent reinforce the ranks of the illegal organizations, but that the number of such revolutionaries is inadequate to meet the requirements of the times. This is all the more so because the worker who spends 11.5 hours a day in the factory is in such a position that he can, in the main, perform only the functions of an agitator, but propaganda and organization, the delivery and reproduction of illegal literature, the issuance of leaflets, etc., are duties which must necessarily fall mainly upon the shoulders of an extremely small force of intellectuals, unquote, Rабочее дело. On many points we agree with BV, particularly with those we have emphasized, which most saliently reveal that, although weary of our amateurism, as is every thinking practical worker, BV cannot find the way out of this intolerable situation because he is weighted down by economism. The fact is that society produces very many persons fit for, quote, the cause, but we are unable to make use of them all. The critical transitional state of our movement in this respect may be formulated as follows. There are no people, yet there is a mass of people. There is a mass of people because the working class and increasingly varied social strata, year after year, produce from their ranks an increasing number of discontented people who desire to protest, who are ready to render all the assistance they can in the struggle against absolutism, the intolerableness of which, though not yet recognized by all, is more and more acutely sensed by increasing masses of the people. At the same time, we have no people because we have no leaders, no political leaders, no talented organizers capable of arranging extensive and at the same time uniform and harmonious work that would employ all forces, even the most inconsiderable. Quote, the growth and development of the revolutionary organizations lag not only behind the growth of the working class movement, which even BV admits, but behind that of the general democratic movement among all strata of the people. In passing, probably BV would now regard this as supplementing his conclusion. The scope of revolutionary work is too narrow as compared with the breadth of the spontaneous basis of the movement. It is too hemmed in by the wretched theory of, quote, economic struggle against the employers and the government, unquote. Yet, at the present time, not only social democratic political agitators, but social democratic organizers must, quote, go among all classes of the population. There is hardly a single practical worker who will doubt that the Social Democrats could distribute the 1,001 minute functions of their organizational work among individual representatives of the most varied classes. Lack of specialization is one of the most serious defects of our technique, about which BV justly and bitterly complains. The smaller each separate, quote, operation in our common cause, the more people we can find capable of carrying out such operations. People who, in the majority of cases, are completely incapable of becoming professional revolutionaries. More difficult will it be for the police to net all these detail workers, and the more difficult will it be for them to frame up, out of an arrest for some petty affair, a, quote, case that would justify the government's expenditure on, quote, security. As for the number of people ready to help us, we referred in the preceding chapter to the gigantic change that has taken place in this respect in the last 5 years or so. On the other hand, in order to unite all these tiny fractions into one whole, in order not to break up the movement while breaking up its functions, and in order to imbue the people who carry out the minute functions with the conviction that their work is necessary and important, without which conviction they will never do the work, it is necessary to have a strong organization of tried revolutionaries. The more secret such an organization is, the more stronger and widespread will be the confidence in the party. As we know, in time of war, it is not only of the utmost importance to imbue one's own army with confidence in its strength, but it is important also to convince the enemy and all neutral elements of this strength. Friendly neutrality may sometimes decide the issue. If such an organization existed, one built up on a firm theoretical foundation and possessing a social democratic organ, we should have no reason to fear that the movement might be diverted from its path by the numerous, quote, outside elements that are attracted to it. On the contrary, it is precisely at the present time, with amateurism prevalent, that we see many social democrats leaning towards the credo and only imagining that they are social democrats. In a word, specialization necessarily presupposes centralization and in turn imperatively calls for it. But BV himself, who has so excellently described the necessity for specialization, underestimates its importance, in our opinion, in the second part of the argument we have quoted. The number of working class revolutionaries is inadequate, he says. This is perfectly true, and once again we stress that the, quote, valuable communication of a close observer fully confirms our view of the causes of the present crisis in social democracy, and consequently of the means required to overcome it. Not only are revolutionaries in general lagging behind the spontaneous awakening of the masses, but even worker revolutionaries are lagging behind the spontaneous awakening of the working class masses. This fact confirms with clear evidence, from the practical point of view, too, not only the absurdity, but even the politically reactionary nature of the pedagogics to which we are so often treated in the discussion of our duties to the workers. This fact proves that our very first and most pressing duty is to help to train working class revolutionaries who will be on the same level in regard to party activity as the revolutionaries from amongst the intellectuals. We emphasize the words, quote, in regard to party activity, unquote, for although necessary, it is neither so easy nor so pressingly necessary to bring the workers up to the level of intellectuals in other respects. Attention, therefore, must be devoted principally to raising the workers to the level of revolutionaries. It is not at all our task to descend to the level of the, quote, working masses, as the economists wish to do, or to the level of the, quote, average worker, as Svoboda desires to do, and by this ascends to the second grade of economist pedagogics. I am far from denying the necessity for popular literature for the workers, and especially popular, of course not vulgar, literature for the especially backward workers. But what annoys me is the constant confusion of pedagogics with questions of politics and organization. You, gentlemen, who are so much concerned about the, quote, average worker, as a matter of fact, rather insult the workers by your desire to talk down to them when discussing working class politics and working class organization. Talk about serious things in a serious manner. Leave pedagogics to the pedagogues and not to politicians and organizers. Are there not advanced people, quote, average people, and quote, masses, among the intelligentsia too? Does not everyone recognize that popular literature is also required for the intelligentsia, and is not such literature written? Imagine someone, in an article on organizing college or high school students, repeating over and over again, as if he had made a new discovery, that first of all we must have an organization of, quote, average students. The author of such an article would be ridiculed, and rightly so. Give us your ideas on organization, if you have any, he would be told, and we ourselves will decide who is, quote, average, who above average, and who below. But if you have no organizational ideas of your own, then all your exertions in behalf of the, quote, masses and, quote, average people will be simply boring. You must realize that these questions of, quote, politics and, quote, organization are so serious in themselves that they cannot be dealt with in any other but a serious way. We can and must educate workers and university and gymnasium students so that we may be able to discuss these questions with them. But once you do bring up these questions, you, quote, must give real replies to them. Do not fall back on the average or the masses, unquote. Do not try to dispose of the matter with facetious remarks and mere phrases. To be fully prepared for his task, the worker revolutionary must likewise become a professional revolutionary. Hence, BV is wrong in saying that since the worker spends 11.5 hours in the factory, the brunt of all other revolutionary functions, apart from agitation, quote, must necessarily fall mainly upon the shoulders of an extremely small force of intellectuals, unquote. But this condition does not obtain out of sheer, quote, necessity. It obtains because we are backward, because we do not recognize our duty to assist every capable worker to become a professional agitator, organizer, propagandist, literature distributor, etc., etc. In this respect, we waste our strength in a positively shameful manner. We lack the ability to husband that which should be tended and reared with special care. Look at the Germans. Their forces are 100-fold greater than ours, but they understand perfectly well that really capable agitators, etc., are not often promoted from the ranks of the, quote, average. For this reason, they immediately try to place every capable working man in conditions that will enable him to develop and apply his abilities to the fullest. He is made a professional agitator. He is encouraged to widen the field of his activity, to spread it from one factory to the whole of the industry, from a single locality to the whole country. He acquires experience and dexterity in his profession. He broadens his outlook and increases his knowledge. He observes at close quarters the prominent political leaders from other localities and of other parties. He strives to rise to their level and combine in himself the knowledge of the working class movement and the freshness of socialist convictions with professional skill, without which the proletariat cannot wage a stubborn struggle against its excellently trained enemies. In this way alone do the working masses produce men of the stamp of Babel and Auer. But what is to a great extent automatic in a politically free country must in Russia be done deliberately and systematically by our organizations. A worker agitator who is at all gifted and, quote, promising must not be left to work 11 hours a day in a factory. We must arrange that he be maintained by the party, that he may go underground in good time, that he change the place of his activity if he is to enlarge his experience, widen his outlook, and be able to hold out for at least a few years in the struggle against the gendarmes. As the spontaneous rise of their movement becomes broader and deeper, the working class masses promote from their ranks not only an increasing number of talented agitators, but also talented organizers, propagandists, and, quote, practical workers, in the best sense of the term, of whom there are so few among us intellectuals who, for the most part, in the Russian manner, are somewhat careless and sluggish in their habits. When we have forces of specially trained worker revolutionaries who have gone through extensive preparation, and of course revolutionaries, quote, of all arms of the service, unquote, no political police in the world will then be able to contend with them, for these forces, boundlessly devoted to the revolution, will enjoy the boundless confidence of the widest masses of the workers. We are directly to blame for doing too little to, quote, stimulate the workers to take this path, common to them and to the, quote, intellectuals, of professional revolutionary training, and for all too often dragging them back by our silly speeches about what is, quote, accessible to the masses of the workers, to the, quote, average workers, etc. In this, as in other respects, the narrow scope of our organizational work is without a doubt due directly to the fact, although the overwhelming majority of the, quote, economists and the novices in practical work do not perceive it, that we restrict our theories and our political tasks to a single field. Subservience to spontaneity seems to inspire a fear of taking even one step away from what is, quote, accessible to the masses, a fear of rising too high above mere attendance on the immediate and direct requirements of the masses. Have no fear, gentlemen. Remember that we stand so low on the plane of organization that the very idea that we could rise too high is absurd. Section 4.5, quote, conspiratorial organization and, quote, democratism. Yet there are many people among us who are sensitive to the, quote, voice of life, that they fear it more than anything in the world, and charge the adherents of the views here expounded with following a Narodnaya Volya line, with failing to understand democratism, etc. These accusations, which of course have been echoed by Robochie Diallo, need to be dealt with. The writer of these lines knows very well that the St. Petersburg economists leveled the charge of Narodnaya Volya tendencies also against Robochia Gazeta, which is quite understandable when one compares it with Robochia Missal. We were not in the least surprised, therefore, when soon after the appearance of Iskra, a comrade informed us that the Social Democrats in the town of X describe Iskra as a Narodnaya Volya organ. We, of course, were flattered by this accusation, for what decent Social Democrat has not been accused by the economists of being a Narodnaya Volya sympathizer? These accusations are the result of a twofold misunderstanding. First, the history of the revolutionary movement is so little known among us that the name Narodnaya Volya is used to denote any idea of a militant centralized organization which declares determined war upon Tsarism. But the magnificent organization that the revolutionaries had in the 70s, and that should serve us as a model, was not established by the Narodnaya Volya, but by the Zemlya i Volya, which split up into the Chorny Peredel and the Narodnaya Volya. Consequently, to regard a militant revolutionary organization as something specifically Narodnaya Volya in character is absurd both historically and logically, for no revolutionary trend, if it seriously thinks of struggle, can dispense with such an organization. The mistake the Narodnaya Volya committed was not in striving to enlist all the discontented in the organization and to direct this organization to resolute struggle against the autocracy. On the contrary, that was its great historical merit. The mistake was in relying on a theory which in substance was not a revolutionary theory at all, and the Narodnaya Volya members either did not know how or were unable to link their movement inseparably with the class struggle in the developing capitalist society. Only a gross failure to understand Marxism, or an, quote, understanding of it in the spirit of, quote, Struvism, could prompt the opinion that the rise of a mass, spontaneous working class movement relieves us of the duty of creating as good an organization of revolutionaries as the Zemlya i Volya had, or indeed an incomparably better one. On the contrary, this movement imposes the duty upon us, for the spontaneous struggle of the proletariat will not become its genuine class struggle until this struggle is led by a strong organization of revolutionaries. Secondly, many people, including apparently B. Khrushchevsky, Robochie Diallo number 10, misunderstand the polemics that Social Democrats have always waged against the, quote, conspiratorial view of the political struggle. We have always protested, and will, of course, continue to protest against confining the political struggle to conspiracy. But this does not, of course, mean that we deny the need for a strong revolutionary organization. Thus, in the pamphlet mentioned in the preceding footnote, after the polemics against reducing the political struggle to a conspiracy, a description is given as a social democratic ideal of an organization so strong as to be able to, quote, resort to rebellion, and to every, quote, other form of attack in order to, quote, deliver a smashing blow against absolutism, unquote. In form, such a strong revolutionary organization in an autocratic country may also be described as a, quote, conspiratorial organization, because the French word conspiration is the equivalent of the Russian word zagovar, conspiracy, and such an organization must have the utmost secrecy. Secrecy is such a necessary condition for this kind of organization that all the other conditions, number and selection of members, functions, etc., must be made to conform to it. It would be extremely naive indeed, therefore, to fear the charge that we Social Democrats desire to create a conspiratorial organization. Such a charge should be as flattering to every opponent of economism as the charge of following a Narodnaya Volya line. The objection may be raised that such a powerful and strictly secret organization, which concentrates in its hands all the threads of secret activities, an organization which of necessity is centralized, may too easily rush into a premature attack, may thoughtlessly intensify the movement before the growth of its political discontent, the intensity of the ferment and anger of the working class, etc., have made such an attack possible and necessary. Our reply is this: speaking abstractly, it cannot be denied, of course, that a militant organization may thoughtlessly engage in battle, which may end in a defeat entirely avoidable under other conditions. But we cannot confine ourselves to abstract reasoning on such a question, because every battle bears within itself the abstract possibility of defeat, and there is no way of reducing this possibility except by organized preparation for battle. If, however, we proceed from the concrete conditions at present obtaining in Russia, we must come to the positive conclusion that a strong revolutionary organization is absolutely necessary precisely for the purpose of giving stability to the movement and of safeguarding it against the possibility of making thoughtless attacks. Precisely at the present time, when no such organization yet exists, and when the revolutionary movement is rapidly and spontaneously growing, we already observe two opposite extremes, which, as is to be expected, quote, meet. These are the utterly unsound economism and the preaching of moderation, and the equally unsound excited of terror, which strives, quote, artificially to call forth symptoms of the end of the movement, which is developing and strengthening itself when this movement is as yet nearer to the start than to the end, unquote, quoting V. Zasulik in Zarya number 2 and 3. And the instance of Robochye Dielo shows that there exist social democrats who give way to both these extremes. This is not surprising, for apart from other reasons, the, quote, economic struggle against the employers and the government can never satisfy revolutionaries, and opposite extremes will therefore always appear here and there. Only a centralized, militant organization that consistently carries out a social democratic policy, that satisfies, so to speak, all revolutionary instincts and strivings, can safeguard the movement against making thoughtless attacks and prepare attacks that hold out the promise of success. A further objection may be raised that the views on organization here expounded contradict the, quote, democratic principle. Now, while the earlier accusation was specifically Russian in origin, this one is specifically foreign in character, and only an organization abroad, namely the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad, was capable of giving its editorial board instructions like the following, quote, organizational principle. In order to secure the successful development and unification of social democracy, the broad democratic principle of party organization must be emphasized, developed, and fought for. This is particularly necessary in view of the anti-democratic tendencies that have revealed themselves in the ranks of our party, unquote. We shall see in the next chapter how Rabotchi Diallo combats Iskra's, quote, anti-democratic tendencies. For the present, we shall examine more closely the, quote, principle that the economists advance. Everyone will probably agree that, quote, the broad democratic principle presupposes the two following conditions. First, full publicity, and secondly, election to all offices. It would be absurd to speak of democracy without publicity, moreover, without a publicity that is not limited to the membership of the organization. We call the German Socialist Party a democratic organization because all its activities are carried out publicly. Even its party congresses are held in public. But no one would call an organization democratic that is hidden from everyone but its members by a veil of secrecy. What is the use, then, of advancing, quote, the broad democratic principle when the fundamental condition for this principle cannot be fulfilled by a secret organization? Quote, the broad principle proves itself simply to be a resounding but hollow phrase. Moreover, it reveals a total lack of understanding of the urgent tasks of the movement in regard to organization. Everyone knows how great the lack of secrecy is among the broad masses of our revolutionaries. We have heard the bitter complaints of BV on this score and his absolutely just demand for a, quote, strict selection of members in Rabotchi Diallo number 6. Yet, persons who boast a keen, quote, sense of realities urge in a situation like this not the strictest secrecy and the strictest, consequently more restricted, selection of members, but, quote, the broad democratic principle. This is what you call being wide of the mark. Nor is the situation any better with regard to the second attribute of democracy, the principle of election. In politically free countries, this condition is taken for granted. Quote, they are members of the party who accept the principles of the party program and render the party all possible support, unquote, reads Clause 1 of the Rules of the German Social Democratic Party. Since the entire political arena is as open to the public view as is a theater stage to the audience, this acceptance or non-acceptance, support or opposition, is known to all from the press and from public meetings. Everyone knows that a certain political figure began in such and such a way, passed through such and such an evolution, behaved in a trying moment in such and such a manner, and possesses such and such qualities. Consequently, all party members, knowing all the facts, can elect or refuse to elect this person to a particular party office. The general control, in the literal sense of the term, exercised over every act of a party man in the political field brings into existence an automatically operating mechanism which produces what in biology is called the survival of the fittest. Natural selection by full publicity, election, and general control provides the assurance that, in the last analysis, every political figure will be in his proper place to do the work for which he is best fitted by his powers and abilities, feels the effects of his mistakes on himself, and proves before all the world his ability to recognize mistakes and to avoid them. Try to fit this picture into the frame of our autocracy. Is it conceivable in Russia for all, quote, who accept the principles of the party program and render the party all possible support to control every action of the revolutionary working in secret? Is it possible for all to elect one of these revolutionaries to any particular office when, in the very interests of the work, the revolutionary must conceal his identity from 9 out of 10 of these all? Reflect somewhat over the real meaning of these high-sounding phrases to which Rabotchi Diallo gives utterance, and you will realize that, quote, broad democracy in party organization, amidst the gloom of the autocracy and the domination of gendarmerie, is nothing more than a useless and harmful toy. It is a useless toy because, in point of fact, no revolutionary organization has ever practiced, or could practice, broad democracy, however much it may have desired to do so. It is a harmful toy because any attempt to practice the, quote, broad democratic principle will simply facilitate the work of the police in carrying out large-scale raids, will perpetuate the prevailing primitiveness, and will divert the thoughts of the practical workers from the serious and pressing task of training themselves to become professional revolutionaries to that of drawing up detailed, quote, paper rules for election systems. Only abroad, where very often people with no opportunity for conducting really active work gather, could this, quote, playing at democracy develop here and there, especially in small groups. To show the unseemliness of Rabotchi-Diallo's favorite trick of advancing the plausible principle of democracy in revolutionary affairs, we shall again summon a witness. This witness, Y. Serebryakov, editor of the London magazine Nakanoon, has a soft spot for Rabotchi-Diallo and is filled with a great hatred for Plekhanov and the Plekhanovites. In its articles on the split in the Union of Russian Social Democrats abroad, Nakanoon definitely sided with Rabotchi-Diallo and poured a stream of petty abuse upon Plekhanov. All the more valuable, therefore, is this witness in the question at issue. In Nakanoon for July number 7, 1899, an article titled Concerning the Manifesto of the Self-Emancipation of the Workers' Group, Serebryakov argued that it was, quote, indecent to talk about such things as, quote, self-deception, leadership, and the so-called Areopagus in a serious revolutionary movement, and, inter alia, wrote, quote, Mishkin, Rogachev, Gelyabov, Mikhailov, Perovskaya, Figner, and others never regarded themselves as leaders, and no one ever elected or appointed them as such, although in actuality they were leaders because in the propaganda period, as well as in the period of the struggle against the government, they took the brunt of the work upon themselves. They went into the most dangerous places, and their activities were the most fruitful. They became leaders, not because they wished it, but because the comrades surrounding them had confidence in their wisdom, in their energy, in their loyalty. To be afraid of some kind of Areopagus, and if it is not feared, why write about it, that would arbitrarily govern the movement is far too naive. Who would pay heed to it? Unquote. We ask the reader, in what way does the, quote, Areopagus differ from, quote, anti-democratic tendencies? And is it not evident that Rabotchi-Diallo's, quote, plausible organizational principle is equally naive and indecent? Naive because no one would pay heed to the, quote, Areopagus, or people with, quote, anti-democratic tendencies if, quote, the comrades surrounding them had no confidence in their wisdom, energy, and loyalty, unquote. Indecent because it is a demagogic sally calculated to play on the conceit of some, on the ignorance of others regarding the actual state of our movement, and on the lack of training and the ignorance of the history of the revolutionary movement on the part of still others. The only serious organizational principle for the active workers of our movement should be the strictest secrecy, the strictest selection of members, and the training of professional revolutionaries. Given these qualities, something even more than, quote, democratism would be guaranteed to us, namely complete, comradely, mutual confidence among revolutionaries. This is absolutely essential for us because there can be no question of replacing it by general democratic control in Russia. It would be a great mistake to believe that the impossibility of establishing real, quote, democratic control renders the members of the revolutionary organization beyond control altogether. They have not the time to think about toy forms of democratism, democratism within a close and compact body of comrades in which complete mutual confidence prevails. But they have a lively sense of their responsibility, knowing as they do from experience that an organization of real revolutionaries will stop at nothing to rid itself of an unworthy member. Moreover, there is a fairly well-developed public opinion in Russian and international revolutionary circles which has a long history behind it, and which sternly and ruthlessly punishes every departure from the duties of comradeship and, quote, democratism, real and not toy democratism, certainly forms a component part of the conception of comradeship. Take all this into consideration, and you will realize that this talk and these resolutions about anti-democratic tendencies have the musty odor of the playing at generals, which is indulged in abroad. It must be observed also that the other source of this talk, viz., naivete, is likewise fostered by the confusion of ideas concerning the meaning of democracy. In Mr. and Mrs. Webb's book on the English trade unions, there is an interesting chapter entitled, quote, Primitive Democracy. In it, the authors relate how the English workers, in the first period of existence of their unions, considered it an indispensable sign of democracy for all the members to do all the work of managing the unions. Not only were all questions decided by the vote of all the members, but all official duties were fulfilled by all the members in turn. A long period of historical experience was required for workers to realize the absurdity of such a conception of democracy and to make them understand the necessity for representative institutions on the one hand and for full-time officials on the other. Only after a number of cases of financial bankruptcy of trade union treasuries had occurred did the workers realize that the rates and contributions of benefits cannot be decided merely by a democratic vote, but that this also requires the advice of insurance experts. Let us take also Kautsky's book on parliamentarism and legislation by the people. There we find that the conclusions drawn by the Marxist theoretician coincide with the lessons learned from many years of practical experience by the workers who organized, quote, spontaneously. Kautsky strongly protests against Rittinghausen's primitive conception of democracy. He ridicules those who, in the name of democracy, demand that, quote, popular newspapers shall be edited directly by the people. He shows the need for professional journalists, parliamentarians, etc., for the social democratic leadership of the proletarian class struggle. He attacks the, quote, socialism of anarchists and litterateurs who, in their, quote, striving for effect, extol direct legislation by the whole people, completely failing to understand that this idea can be applied only relatively in modern society. Those who have performed practical work in our movement know how widespread the, quote, primitive conception of democracy is among the masses of the students and workers. It is not surprising that this conception penetrates also into rules of organizations and into literature. The economists of the Bernsteinian persuasion included in their rules the following, quote, all affairs affecting the interests of the whole of the union organization shall be decided by a majority vote of all its members, unquote. The economists of the terrorist persuasion repeat after them, quote, the decisions of the committee shall become effective only after they have been referred to all the circles, unquote. That's from Svoboda number 1. Observe that this proposal for a widely applied referendum is advanced in addition to the demand that the whole of the organization be built on an elective basis. We would not, of course, on this account, condemn practical workers who have had too few opportunities for studying the theory and practice of real democratic organizations. But when Robochia Dielo, which lays claim to leadership, confines itself under such conditions to a resolution on broad democratic principles, can this be described as anything but a mere, quote, striving for effect? Section 4.6, Local and All Russia Work. The objections raised against the plan of organization here outlined on the grounds that it is undemocratic and conspiratorial are totally unsound. Nevertheless, there remains a question which is frequently put and which deserves detailed examination. This is the question of the relations between local work and all Russia work. Fears are expressed that the formation of a centralized organization may shift the center of gravity from the former to the latter, damage the movement through weakening our contacts with the working masses, and the continuity of local agitation generally. To these fears, we reply that our movement in the past few years has suffered precisely from the fact that local workers have been too absorbed in local work, that therefore it is absolutely necessary to shift the center of gravity somewhat to national work, and that, far from weakening, this would strengthen our ties and the continuity of our local agitation. Let us take the question of central and local newspapers. I would ask the reader not to forget that we cite the publication of newspapers only as an example, illustrating an immeasurably broader and more varied revolutionary activity in general. In the first period of the mass movement, 1896 to 98, an attempt was made by local revolutionary workers to publish an all-Russian newspaper, Rabochaya Gazeta. In the next period, 1898 to 1900, the movement made an enormous stride forward, but the attention of the leaders was wholly absorbed by local publications. If we compute the total number of the local papers that were published, we shall find that, on the average, one issue per month was published. Does this not clearly illustrate our amateurism? Does this not clearly show that our revolutionary organization lags behind the spontaneous growth of the movement? If the same number of issues had been published, not by scattered local groups, but by a single organization, we would not only have saved an enormous amount of effort, but we would have secured immeasurably greater stability and continuity in our work. This simple point is frequently lost sight of by those practical workers who work actively and almost exclusively on local publications. Unfortunately, this is true even now in the overwhelming majority of cases, as well as by the publicists who display an astonishing quixotism on this question. The practical workers usually rest content with the argument that, quote, it is difficult for local workers to engage in the organization of an all-Russian newspaper, and that local newspapers are better than no newspapers at all. This argument is, of course, perfectly just, and we, no less than any practical worker, appreciate the enormous importance and usefulness of local newspapers in general. But this is not the point. The point is, can we not overcome the fragmentation and primitiveness that are so glaringly expressed in the 30 issues of local newspapers that have been published throughout Russia in the course of 2.5 years? Do not restrict yourselves to the indisputable, but too general statement about the usefulness of local newspapers generally. Have the courage, frankly, to admit their negative aspects revealed by the experience of 2.5 years. This experience has shown that under the conditions in which we work, these local newspapers prove, in the majority of the cases, to be unstable in their principles, devoid of political significance, extremely costly in regard to expenditure of revolutionary forces, and totally unsatisfactory from a technical point of view. I have in mind, of course, not the technique of printing, but the frequency and regularity of publication. These defects are not accidental. They're the inevitable outcome of the fragmentation which, on the one hand, explains the predominance of local newspapers in the period under review, and on the other is fostered by this predominance. It is positively beyond the strength of a separate local organization to raise its newspaper to the level of a political organ maintaining stability of principles. It is beyond its strength to collect and utilize sufficient material to shed light on the whole of our political life. The argument usually advanced to support the need for numerous local newspapers in free countries that the cost of printing by local workers is low and that the people can be kept more fully and quickly informed. This argument, as experience has shown, speaks against local newspapers in Russia. They turn out to be excessively costly in regard to the expenditure of revolutionary forces and appear very rarely, for the simple reason that the publication of an illegal newspaper, however small its size, requires an extensive secret apparatus, such as is possible with large-scale factory production, for this apparatus cannot be created in a small handicraft workshop. Very frequently, the primitiveness of the secret apparatus, every practical worker can cite numerous cases, enables the police to take advantage of the publication and distribution of 1 or 2 issues to make mass arrests, which result in such a clean sweep that it becomes necessary to start all over again. A well-organized secret apparatus requires professionally well-trained revolutionaries and a division of labor applied with the greatest consistency, but both these requirements are beyond the strength of a separate local organization, however strong it may be at any given moment. Not only the general interests of our movement as a whole, training of the workers in consistent socialist and political principles, but also specifically local interests, are better served by non-local newspapers. This may seem paradoxical at first sight, but it has been proved to the hilt by the 2.5 years of experience referred to. Everyone will agree that had all the local forces that were engaged in the publication of the 30 issues of newspapers worked on a single newspaper, 60, if not 100 issues could easily have been published with a fuller expression, in consequence, of all the specifically local features of the movement. True, it is no easy matter to attain such a degree of organization, but we must realize the need for it. Every local study circle must think about it and work actively to achieve it, without waiting for an impetus from outside, without being tempted by the popularity and closer proximity of a local newspaper, which, as our revolutionary experience has shown, proves to a large extent to be illusory. And it is a bad service indeed those publicists render to the practical work who, thinking themselves particularly close to the practical workers, fail to see this illusoriness, and make shift with the astoundingly hollow and cheap argument that we must have local newspapers, we must have district newspapers, and we must have all Russia newspapers. Generally speaking, of course, all these are necessary, but once the solution of a concrete organizational problem is undertaken, surely time and circumstances must be taken into consideration. Is it not quixotic for Svoboda, number one, to write in a special article dealing with the question of a newspaper, quote, "It seems to us that every locality with any appreciable number of workers should have its own workers' newspaper, not a newspaper imported from somewhere, but its very own," unquote. If the publicist who wrote these words refuses to think of their meaning, then at least the reader may do it for him. How many scores, if not hundreds of, quote, localities with any appreciable number of workers there are in Russia, and what a perpetuation of our amateurish methods this would mean if indeed every local organization set about publishing its own newspaper. How this diffusion would facilitate the gendarmerie's task of netting, and without, quote, any appreciable effort, the local revolutionary workers at the very outset of their activity, and of preventing them from developing into real revolutionaries. A reader of an all-Russian newspaper, continues the author, would find little interest in the descriptions of the malpractices of the factory owners and the details of factory life in various towns not his own. But, quote, an inhabitant of Orel would not find Orel affairs dull reading. In every issue he would learn who had been picked for a lambasting and who had been flayed, and he would be in high spirits, unquote. Certainly, the Orel reader is in high spirits, but our publicist's flights of imagination are also high, too high. He should have asked himself whether such concern with trivialities is tactically in order. We are second to none in appreciating the importance and necessity of factory exposures, but it must be borne in mind that we have reached a stage when St. Petersburg folk find it dull reading the St. Petersburg correspondence of the St. Petersburg Rabochia Missal. Leaflets are the medium through which local factory exposures have always been and must continue to be made, but we must raise the level of the newspaper, not lower it to the level of a factory leaflet. What we ask of a newspaper is not so much petty exposures as exposures of the major, typical evils of factory life, exposures based on especially striking facts and capable, therefore, of arousing the interests of all the workers and all leaders of the movement, of really enriching their knowledge, broadening their outlook, and serving as a starting point for awakening new districts and workers from ever newer trade areas. Quote, moreover, in a local newspaper, all the malpractices of the factory administration and other authorities may be denounced then and there. In the case of a general, distant newspaper, however, by the time the news reaches it, the facts will have been forgotten in the source localities. The reader, on getting the paper, will exclaim, "When was that? Who remembers it?" unquote. Precisely, who remembers it? From the same source, we learn that the 30 issues of newspapers, which appeared in the course of 2.5 years, were published in 6 cities. This averages 1 issue per city per half year. And even if our frivolous publicist trebled his estimate of the productivity of local work, which would be wrong in the case of an average town, since it's impossible to increase productivity to any considerable extent by our rule of thumb methods, we would still get only 1 issue every 2 months, i.e. nothing at all like denouncing them then and there. It would suffice, however, for 10 local organizations to combine and send their delegates to take an active part in organizing the general newspaper, to enable us every fortnight to, quote, denounce over the whole of Russia, not petty, but really outstanding and typical evils. No one who knows the state of affairs in our organizations can have the slightest doubt on that score. As for catching the enemy red-handed, if we mean it seriously, and not merely as a pretty phrase, that is quite beyond the ability of an illegal paper generally. It can be done only by a leaflet, because the time limit for exposures of that nature can be a day or two at the most, e.g. the usual brief strikes, violent factory clashes, demonstrations, etc. Quote, "The workers live not only at the factory, but also in the city," unquote, continues our author, rising from the particular to the general, with a strict consistency that would have done honor to Boris Krzyzewski himself, and he refers to matters like municipal councils, municipal hospitals, municipal schools, and demands that workers' newspapers should not ignore municipal affairs in general. This demand, excellent in itself, serves as a particularly vivid illustration of the empty abstraction to which discussions of local newspapers are all too frequently limited. In the first place, if indeed newspapers appeared, quote, in every locality with any appreciable number of workers, with such detailed information on municipal affairs as Svoboda desires, this would, under our Russian conditions, inevitably degenerate into actual concern with trivialities, lead to a weakening of the consciousness of the importance of an all-Russia revolutionary assault upon the Tsarist autocracy, and strengthen the extremely virile shoots, not uprooted but rather hidden or temporarily suppressed, of the tendency that has become noted as a result of the famous remark about revolutionaries who talk a great deal about non-existent parliaments and too little about existent municipal councils. We say inevitably in order to emphasize that Svoboda obviously does not desire this, but the contrary to come about. But good intentions are not enough. For municipal affairs to be dealt with in their proper perspective, in relation to our entire work, this perspective must first be clearly conceived, firmly established, not only by argument but by numerous examples, so that it may acquire the stability of a tradition. This is still far from being the case with us, yet this must be done first, before we can allow ourselves to think and talk about an extensive local press. Secondly, to write really well and interestingly about municipal affairs, one must have first-hand knowledge, not book knowledge of the issues. But there are hardly any social democrats anywhere in Russia who possess such knowledge. To be able to write in newspapers, not in popular pamphlets, about municipal and state affairs, one must have fresh and varied material gathered up and written by able people. And in order to be able to gather and write up such material, we must have something more than the, quote, primitive democracy of a primitive circle, in which everybody does everything and all entertain themselves by playing at referendums. It is necessary to have a staff of expert writers and correspondents, an army of social democratic reporters who establish contacts far and wide, who are able to fathom all sorts of state secrets, the knowledge of which makes the Russian governmental official so puffed up, but the blabbing of which is such an easy matter to him, who are able to penetrate behind the scenes, an army of people who must, as their official duty, be ubiquitous and omniscient. And we, the party that fights against all economic, political, social, and national oppression, can and must find, gather, train, mobilize, and set into motion such an army of omniscient people, all of which requires still to be done. Not only has not a single step in this direction been taken in the overwhelming majority of localities, but even the recognition of its necessity is very often lacking. One will search in vain in our social democratic press for lively and interesting articles, correspondence, and exposures dealing with our big and little affairs, diplomatic, military, ecclesiastical, municipal, financial, etc., etc. There is almost nothing, or very little, about these matters. That is why, quote, it always annoys me frightfully when a man comes to me, utters beautiful and charming words, unquote, about the need for newspapers in, quote, every locality with any appreciable number of workers, unquote, that will expose factory, municipal, and governmental evils. The predominance of the local papers over a central press may be a sign of either poverty or luxury. Of poverty, when the movement has not developed the forces for large-scale production, continues to flounder in amateurism, and is all but swamped with the, quote, petty details of factory life. Of luxury, when the movement has fully mastered the task of comprehensive exposure and comprehensive agitation, and it becomes necessary to publish numerous local newspapers in addition to the central organ. Let each decide for himself what the predominance of local newspapers implies in present-day Russia. I shall limit myself to a precise formulation of my own conclusion to leave no grounds for misunderstanding. Hitherto, the majority of our local organizations have thought almost exclusively in terms of local newspapers and have devoted almost all their activities to this work. This is abnormal. The very opposite should have been the case. The majority of the local organizations should think principally of the publication of an all-Russian newspaper and devote their activities chiefly to it. Until this is done, we shall not be able to establish a single newspaper capable to any degree of serving the movement with comprehensive press agitation. When this is done, however, normal relations between the necessary central newspaper and the necessary local newspapers will be established automatically. It would seem at first glance that the conclusion on the necessity for shifting the center of gravity from local to all Russia work does not apply to the sphere of the specifically economic struggle. In this struggle, the immediate enemies of the workers are the individual employers or groups of employers who are not bound by any organization having even the remotest resemblance to the purely military, strictly centralized organization of the Russian government, our immediate enemy in the political struggle, which is led in all its minutest details by a single will. But that is not the case. As we have repeatedly pointed out, the economic struggle is a trade struggle, and for that reason it requires that the workers be organized according to trades, not only according to place of employment. Organization by trades becomes all the more urgently necessary, for more rapidly our employers are organizing in all sorts of companies and syndicates. Our fragmentation and our amateurism are an outright hindrance to this work of organization, which requires the existence of a single all-Russia body of revolutionaries capable of giving leadership to the all-Russia trade unions. We have described above the type of organization that is needed for this purpose. We shall now add but a few words on the question of our press in this connection. Hardly anyone will doubt the necessity for every social democratic newspaper to have a special department devoted to the trade union or economic struggle, but the growth of the trade union movement compels us to think about the creation of a trade union press. It seems to us, however, that with rare exceptions, there can be no question of trade union newspapers in Russia at the present time. They would be a luxury, and many a time we lack even our daily bread. The form of trade union press that would suit the conditions of our illegal work and is already required at the present time is trade union pamphlets. In these pamphlets, legal and illegal material should be gathered and grouped systematically on the working conditions in a given trade, on the differences in this respect in the various parts of Russia, on the main demands advanced by the workers in the given trade, on the inadequacies of legislation affecting that trade, on outstanding instances of economic struggle by the workers in the trade, on the beginnings, the present state, and the requirements of their trade union organization, etc. Such pamphlets would, in the first place, relieve our social democratic press of a mass of trade details that are of interest only to workers in that given trade. Secondly, they would record the results of our experience in the trade union struggle. They would preserve the gathered material, which now literally gets lost in a mass of leaflets and fragmentary correspondence, and they would summarize this material. Thirdly, they could serve as guides for agitators because working conditions change relatively slowly, and the main demands of the workers in a given trade are extremely stable. For example, the demands advanced by the weavers in the Moscow district in 1885 and in the St. Petersburg district in 1896. A compilation of such demands and needs might serve for years as an excellent handbook for agitators on economic questions in backward localities or among the backward strata of the workers. Examples of successful strikes in a given region, information on higher living standards, on improved working conditions in one locality would encourage the workers in other localities to take up the fight again and again. Fourthly, having made a start in generalizing the trade union struggle, and in this way strengthening the link between the Russian trade union movement and socialism, the Social Democrats would at the same time see to it that our trade union work occupied neither too small nor too large a place in our social democratic work as a whole. A local organization that is cut off from organizations in other towns finds it very difficult, sometimes almost impossible, to maintain a correct sense of proportion. The example of Robochia Missile shows what a monstrous exaggeration can be made in the direction of trade unionism. But an all-Russia organization of revolutionaries that stands undeviatingly on the basis of Marxism, that leads the entire political struggle and possesses a staff of professional agitators, will never find it difficult to determine the proper proportion. Chapter 5. The Plan for an All-Russia Political Newspaper. Quote, "The most serious blunder Iskra committed in this connection," unquote, writes B. Krzyzewski, Robochia Dielo number 10, charging us with a tendency to, quote, "convert theory into a lifeless doctrine by isolating it from practice," quote, "was its plan for a general party organization," viz. the article entitled "Where to Begin." Martynov echoes this idea in declaring that, quote, "Iskra's tendency to belittle the significance of the forward march of the drab everyday struggle in comparison with the propaganda of brilliant and completed ideas was crowned with the plan for the organization of a party which it sets forth in the article entitled Where to Begin in issue number 4, unquote." Finally, L. Nadezdin has of late joined in the chorus of indignation against this, quote, "plan." The quotation marks were meant to express sarcasm. In his pamphlet, which we have just received, entitled The Eve of the Revolution, published by the revolutionary socialist group Svoboda, whose acquaintance we have made, he declares, quote, "To speak now of an organization held together by an all-Russian newspaper means propagating armchair ideas and armchair work," unquote, and represents a manifestation of, quote, "bookishness," etc. That our terrorist turns out to be in agreement with the champions of the, quote, "forward march of the drab everyday struggle" is not surprising, since we have traced the roots of this intimacy between them in the chapters on politics and organization. But must draw attention here to the fact that Nadezdin is the only one who has conscientiously tried to grasp the train of thought in an article he disliked and has made an attempt to reply to the point, whereas Robochia Dielo has said nothing that is material to the subject, but has tried merely to confuse the question by a series of unseemly demagogic sallies. Unpleasant though the task may be, we must first spend some time in cleansing this Augean stable. Section 5.1. Who was offended by the article Where to Begin? Let us present a small selection of the expletives and exclamations that Robochia Dielo hurled at us. Quote, "It is not a newspaper that can create a party organization, but vice versa. A newspaper standing above the party, outside of its control and independent of it, thanks to its having its own staff of agents. Quote, by what miracle has Iskra forgotten about the actually existing social democratic organizations of the party to which it belongs? Quote, those who possess firm principles and a corresponding plan are the supreme regulators of the real struggle of the party and dictate to it their plan. Quote, the plan drives our active and virile organizations into the kingdom of shadows and desires to call into being a fantastic network of agents. Quote, were Iskra's plan carried into effect, every trace of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party which is taking shape would be obliterated. Quote, a propagandist organ becomes an uncontrolled autocratic lawmaker for the entire practical revolutionary struggle. Quote, how should our party react to the suggestion that it be completely subordinated to an autonomous editorial board, etc., etc., etc. Quick comment from S4A. Reminds me a little bit of the Jimmy Dore forced to vote issue that came up last month with regard to a YouTube host, quote, dictating to the movement what to do. Identical indignation here. All right, coming back. As the reader can see from the contents and the tone of these above quotations, Rabocciadiello has taken offense. Offense, not for its own sake. Just commenting again, Rabocciadiello here might as well be like the Young Turks or something. Offense, not for its own sake, but for the sake of the organizations and committees of our party, which it alleges Iskra desires to drive into the kingdom of shadows, and whose very traces it would obliterate. How terrible! But a curious thing should be noted. The article Where to Begin appeared in May 1901. The articles in Rabocciadiello appeared in September 1901. Now we're in mid-January 1902. During these 5 months, prior to and after September, not a single committee and not a single organization of the party protested formally against this monster that seeks to drive them into the kingdom of shadows, and yet scores and hundreds of communications from all parts of Russia have appeared during this period in Iskra, as well as in numerous local and non-local publications. How could it happen that those who would be driven into the realm of shadows are not aware of it and have not taken offense, although a third party has? The explanation is that the committees and other organizations are engaged in real work and are not playing at, quote, democracy. The committees read the article Where to Begin, saw that it represented an attempt, quote, to elaborate a definite plan for an organization so that its formation may be undertaken from all aspects, unquote. And since they knew and saw very well that not one of these sides would dream of setting about to build it until it was convinced of its necessity and of the correctness of the architectural plan, it has naturally never occurred to them to take offense at the boldness of the people who said in Iskra, quote, in view of the pressing importance of the question, we, on our part, take the liberty of submitting to the comrades a skeleton plan to be developed in greater detail in a pamphlet now in preparation for the print, unquote. With a conscientious approach to the work, was it possible to view things otherwise than if the comrades accepted the plan submitted to them, they would carry it out, not because they are, quote, subordinate, but because they would be convinced of its necessity for our common cause, and that if they did not accept it, then the, quote, skeleton, a pretentious word, is it not, would remain merely a skeleton? Is it not demagogy to fight against the skeleton of a plan, not only by, quote, picking it to pieces and advising comrades to reject it, but by inciting people inexperienced in revolutionary matters against its authors, merely on the grounds that they dare to, quote, legislate and come out as the, quote, supreme regulators, i.e. because they dare to propose an outline of a plan? Can our party develop and make progress if an attempt to raise local functionaries to broader views, tasks, plans, etc. is objected to, not only with the claim that these views are erroneous, but on the grounds that the very, quote, desire to, quote, raise us gives, quote, offense? Nadezhdin, too, quote, picked our plan to pieces, but he did not sink to such demagogy as cannot be explained solely by naivete or by primitiveness of political views. From the outset, he emphatically rejected the charge that we intended to establish a, quote, inspectorship over the party. That is why Nadezhdin's criticism of the plan can and should be answered on its merits, while Rabocciadiello deserves only to be treated with contempt. But contempt for a writer who sinks so low as to shout about autocracy and subordination does not relieve us of the duty of disentangling the confusion that such people create in the minds of their readers. Here we can clearly demonstrate to the world the nature of catchwords like, quote, broad democracy. We are accused of forgetting the committees, of desiring or attempting to drive them into the kingdom of shadows, etc. How can we reply to these charges when, out of considerations of secrecy, we can give the reader almost no facts regarding our real relationships with the committees? Persons hurling vehement accusations calculated to provoke the crowd proved to be ahead of us because of their brazenness and their disregard of the duty of a revolutionary to conceal carefully from the eyes of the world the relationships and contacts which he remains, which he is establishing or trying to establish. Naturally, we refuse once and for all to compete with such people in the field of, quote, democratism. As to the reader who is not initiated in all party affairs, the only way in which we can discharge our duty to him is to acquaint him, not with what is and what is in verity, but with a particle of what has taken place and what may be told as a thing of the past. The Bund hints that we are, quote, impostors. The Union abroad accuses us of attempting to obliterate all traces of the party. Gentlemen, you will get complete satisfaction when we relate to the public 4 facts concerning the past. First fact, the members of one of the leagues of struggle who took a direct part in founding our party and in sending a delegate to the inaugural party congress reached agreement with a member of the Iskra group regarding the publication of a series of books for workers that were to serve the entire movement. The attempt to publish the series failed, and the pamphlets written for it, The Tasks of the Russian Social Democrats and the New Factory Law, by a circuitous course and through the medium of third parties, found their way abroad where they were published. Second fact, members of the Central Committee of the Bund approached a member of the Iskra group with the proposal to organize what the Bund then described as a, quote, literary laboratory. In making the proposal, they stated that unless this was done, the movement would greatly retrogress. The result of these negotiations was the appearance of the pamphlet, The Working Class Cause in Russia. Third fact, the Central Committee of the Bund, via a provincial town, approached a member of the Iskra group with the proposal that he undertake the editing of the revived Robochia Gazeta, and of course obtained his consent. The offer was later modified. The comrade in question was invited to act as a contributor in view of a new plan for the composition of the editorial board. Also, this proposal, of course, obtained his consent. Articles were sent, which we managed to preserve. Our program, which was a direct protest against Bernsteinism, against the change in the line of the legal literature and of Robochia Missile. Our immediate task, quote, to publish a party organ that shall appear regularly and have close contacts with all the local groups. The drawbacks of the prevailing amateurism. An urgent question, an examination of the objection that it is necessary first to develop the activities of local groups before undertaking the publication of a common organ, an insistence on the paramount importance of a, quote, revolutionary organization, and on the necessity of, quote, developing organization, discipline, and the technique of secrecy to the highest degree of perfection. The proposal to resume publication of Robochia Gazeta was not carried out, and the articles were not published. Fourth fact, a member of the committee that was organizing the second regular Congress of our party communicated to a member of the Iskra group the program of the Congress and proposed that group as editorial board of the revived Robochia Gazeta. This preliminary step, as it were, was later sanctioned by the committee to which this member belonged, and by the Central Committee of the Bund. The Iskra group was notified of the place and time of the Congress, and, uncertain of being able, for certain reasons, to send a delegate, drew up a written report for the Congress. In the report, the idea was suggested that the mere election of a central committee would not only fail to solve the question of unification at a time of such complete disorder as the present, but would even compromise the grand idea of establishing a party in the event of an early, swift, and thorough police roundup, which was more than likely, in view of the prevailing lack of secrecy, that therefore a beginning should be made by inviting all committees and all other organizations to support the revived common organ, which would establish real contacts between all the committees and really train a group of leaders for the entire movement, and that the committees and the party would very easily be able to transform such a group into a central committee as soon as the group had grown and become strong. In consequence of a number of police raids and arrests, however, the Congress could not take place. For security reasons, the report was destroyed, having been read only by a few comrades, including the representatives of one committee. Let the reader now judge for himself the character of the methods employed by the Bund in hinting that we were impostors, or by Robochia Dielo, which accuses us of trying to relegate the committees to the kingdom of shadows and to, quote, substitute for the organization of a party, an organization disseminating the ideas advocated by a single newspaper. It was to the committees, on their repeated invitation, that we reported on the necessity for adopting a definite plan of concerted activities. It was precisely for the party organization that we elaborated this plan in articles sent to Robochia Gazeta and in the report to the party congress, again on the invitation of those who held such an influential position in the party that they took the initiative in its actual restoration. Only after the twice repeated attempts of the party organization in conjunction with ourselves, officially, to revive the central organ of the party had failed, did we consider it our bounden duty to publish an unofficial organ in order that with the third attempt, the comrades might have before them the results of experience and not merely conjectural proposals. Now certain results of this experience are present for all to see, and all comrades may now judge whether we properly understood our duties and what should be thought of people that strive to mislead those unacquainted with the immediate past simply because they are piqued at our having pointed out to some their inconsistency on the national question, and to others the inadmissibility of their vacillation in matters of principle. Section 5.2. Can a newspaper be a collective organizer? The quintessence of the article Where to Begin consists in the fact that it discusses precisely this question and gives an affirmative reply to it. As far as we know, the only attempt to examine this question on its merits and to prove that it must be answered in the negative was made by L. Nadezhdin, whose argument we reproduce here in full. Quote, "It pleased us greatly to see Iskra number 4 present the question of the need for an all-Russian newspaper, but we cannot agree that this presentation bears relevance to the title Where to Begin. Undoubtedly, this is an extremely important matter, but neither a newspaper, nor a series of popular leaflets, nor a mountain of manifestos can serve as the basis for a militant organization in revolutionary times. We must set to work to build strong political organizations in the localities. We lack such organizations. We've been carrying on our work mainly among enlightened workers, while the masses have been engaged almost exclusively in the economic struggle. If strong political organizations are not trained locally, what significance will even an excellently organized all-Russia newspaper have? It will be a burning bush, burning without being consumed, but firing no one. Iskra thinks that around it and in the activities in its behalf, people will gather and organize. But they will find it far easier to gather and organize around activities that are more concrete. This something more concrete must and should be the extensive organization of local newspapers, the immediate preparation of the workers' forces for demonstrations, the constant activity of local organizations among the unemployed, indefatigable distribution of pamphlets and leaflets, convening of meetings, appeals to actions of protest against the government, etc. We must begin live political work in the localities, and when the time comes to unite on this real basis, it will not be an artificial paper unity. Not by means of newspapers can such a unification of local work into an all-Russia cause be achieved. We have emphasized the passages in this eloquent tirade that most clearly show the author's incorrect judgment of our plan, as well as the incorrectness of his point of view in general, which is here contraposed to that of Iskra. Unless we train strong political organizations in the localities, even an excellently organized all-Russian newspaper will be of no avail. This is incontrovertible. But the whole point is that there is no other way of training strong political organizations except through the medium of an all-Russian newspaper. The author missed the most important statement Iskra made before it proceeded to set forth its plan, that it was necessary, quote, to call for the formation of a revolutionary organization capable of uniting all forces and guiding the movement in actual practice and not in name alone, that is, an organization ready at any time to support every protest and every outbreak and use it to build up and consolidate the fighting forces suitable for the decisive struggle, unquote. But now, after the February and March events, everyone will agree with this in principle, continues Iskra. Yet what we need is not a solution of the question in principle, but its practical solution. We must immediately advance a definite constructive plan through which all may immediately set to work to build from every side. Now we are again being dragged away from the practical solution towards something which in principle is correct, indisputable, and great, but which is entirely inadequate and incomprehensible to the broad masses of workers, namely, quote, to rear strong political organizations. This is not the point at issue, most worthy author. The point is how to go about the rearing and how to accomplish it. It is not true to say that, quote, we have been carrying on our work mainly among enlightened workers, while the masses have been engaged almost exclusively in the economic struggle, unquote. Presented in such a form, the thesis reduces itself to Svoboda's usual but fundamentally false contraposition of the enlightened workers to the, quote, masses. In recent years, even the enlightened workers have been, quote, engaged almost exclusively in the economic struggle, unquote. That is the first point. On the other hand, the masses will never learn to conduct the political struggle until we help to train leaders for this struggle, both from among the enlightened workers and from among the intellectuals. Such leaders can acquire training solely by systematically evaluating all the everyday aspects of our political life, all attempts at protest and struggle on the part of the various classes and on various grounds. Therefore, to talk of, quote, rearing political organizations, and at the same time to contrast the, quote, paperwork of a political newspaper to, quote, live political work in the localities is plainly ridiculous. Iskra has adopted its plan for a newspaper to the plan for creating a, quote, militant preparedness to support the unemployed movement, peasant revolts, discontent among the Zemstvo people, quote, popular indignation against some czarist Bashi Bazook on the rampage, unquote, etc. Anyone who is at all acquainted with the movement knows full well that the vast majority of local organizations have never even dreamed of these things, that many of the prospects of, quote, live political work, here indicated, have never been realized by a single organization, that the attempt, for example, to call attention to the growth of discontent and protest among the Zemstvo intelligentsia rouses feelings of consternation and perplexity in Nadezhdin. Quote, good Lord, is this newspaper intended for Zemstvo people? Among the economists and among many practical workers. Under these circumstances, it is possible to, quote, begin only by inducing people to think about all these things, to summarize and generalize all the diverse signs of ferment and active struggle. In our time, when social democratic tasks are being degraded, the only way, quote, live political work can be begun is with live political agitation, which is impossible unless we have an all-Russia newspaper, frequently issued and regularly distributed. Those who regard the Iskra, quote, plan as a manifestation of, quote, bookishness have totally failed to understand its substance and take for the goal that which is suggested as the most suitable means for the present time. These people have not taken the trouble to study the two comparisons that were drawn to present a clear illustration of the plan. Iskra wrote, the publication of an all-Russia political newspaper must be the main line by which we may unswervingly develop, deepen, and expand the organization, viz., the revolutionary organization that is ever ready to support every protest and every outbreak. Pray tell me, when bricklayers lay bricks in various parts of an enormous, unprecedentedly large structure, is it, quote, paperwork to use a line to help them find the correct place for the bricklaying, to indicate to them the ultimate goal of the common work, to enable them to use not only every brick, but even every piece of brick, which, cemented to the bricks laid before and after it, forms a continuous, finished line? And are we not now passing through precisely such a period in our party life, when we have bricks and bricklayers but lack the guideline for all to see and follow? Let them shout that in stretching out the line, we want to command. Had we desired to command, gentlemen, we would have written it on the title page, not Iskra number 1, but Robochia Gazeta number 3, as we were invited to do by certain comrades, and as we would have had a perfect right to do after the events described above. But we did not do that. We wished to have our hands free to wage an irreconcilable struggle against all pseudo-social democrats. We wanted our line, if properly laid, to be respected because it was correct, and not because it had been laid by an official organ. Quote, the question of uniting local activity in central bodies runs in a vicious circle. Nadezhdin lectures us. Quote, unification requires homogeneity of the elements, and the homogeneity can be created only by something that unites, but the unifying element may be the product of strong local organizations, which at the present time are by no means distinguished for their homogeneity, unquote. This truth is as revered and as irrefutable as that we must train strong political organizations, and it is equally barren. Every question, quote, runs in a vicious circle because political life as a whole is an endless chain consisting of an infinite number of links. The whole art of politics lies in finding and taking as firm a grip as we can of the link that is the least likely to be struck from our hands, the one that is the most important at the given moment, the one that most of all guarantees its possessor the possession of the whole chain. If we had a crew of experienced bricklayers who had learned to work so well together that they could lay their bricks exactly as required without a guideline, which, speaking abstractly, is by no means impossible, then perhaps we might take hold of some other link. But it is unfortunate that as yet we have no experienced bricklayers trained for teamwork, that bricks are often laid where they are not needed at all, that they are not laid according to the general line, but are so scattered that the enemy can shatter the entire structure as if it were made of sand and not of bricks. Another comparison, quote, a newspaper is not only a collective propagandist and a collective agitator, it is also a collective organizer. In this respect, it may be compared to the scaffolding erected around a building under construction. It marks the contours of the structure and facilitates communication between the builders, permitting them to distribute the work and to view the common results achieved by their organized labor, unquote. Does this sound anything like the attempt of an armchair author to exaggerate his role? The scaffolding is not required at all for the dwelling. It is made of cheaper material. It is put up only temporarily, and it's scrapped for firewood as soon as the shell of the structure is completed. As for the building of revolutionary organizations, experience shows that sometimes they may be built without scaffolding, as the 70s showed. But at the present time, we cannot even imagine the possibility of erecting the building we require without scaffolding. Nadezhdin disagrees with this, saying, quote, Iskra thinks that around it and in the activities in its behalf, people will gather and organize. They will find it far easier to gather and organize around activities that are more concrete. Indeed, quote, far easier around activities that are more concrete, unquote. A Russian proverb holds, don't spit into a well, you may want to drink from it. But there are people who do not object to drinking from a well that has been spat into. What despicable things are magnificent, legal, quote, critics of Marxism and illegal admirers of Rabotchia Missile have said in the name of this something more concrete. How restricted our movement is by our own narrowness, lack of initiative, and hesitation, which are justified with the traditional argument about finding it, quote, far easier to gather around something more concrete. And Nadezhdin, who regards himself as possessing a particularly keen sense of the, quote, realities of life, who so severely condemns, quote, armchair authors, and with pretensions to wit, accuses Iskra of a weakness for seeing economism everywhere, and who sees himself standing far above the division between the orthodox and the critics, fails to see that with his arguments he contributes to the narrowness that arouses his indignation and that he is drinking from the most spat in well. The sincerest indignation against narrowness, the most passionate desire to raise its worshippers from their knees, will not suffice if the indignant one is swept along without sail or rudder and as, quote, spontaneously as the revolutionaries of the 70s, clutches at such things as, quote, excitative terror, quote, agrarian terror, quote, sounding the tocsin, etc. Let us take a glance at these, quote, more concrete activities around which he thinks it will be, quote, far easier to gather and organize. 1, local newspapers. 2, preparations for demonstrations. 3, work among the unemployed. It is immediately apparent that all these things have been seized upon at random as a pretext for saying something. For, however we may regard them, it would be absurd to see in them anything especially suitable for, quote, gathering and organizing. The selfsame Nadezhdin says a few pages further, quote, it is time we simply stated the fact that activity of a very pitiable kind is being carried on in the localities. The committees are not doing a tenth of what they could do. The coordinating centers we have at present are the purest fiction, representing a sort of revolutionary bureaucracy, whose members mutually grant generalships to one another. And so it will continue until strong local organizations grow up, unquote. These remarks, though exaggerating the position somewhat, no doubt contain many a bitter truth. But can it be said that Nadezhdin does not perceive the connection between the pitiable activity in the localities and the narrow mental outlook of the functionaries, the narrow scope of their activities, inevitable in the circumstances of the lack of training of party workers confined to local organizations? Has he, like the author of the article on organization, published in Svoboda, forgotten how the transition to a broad local press from 1898 was accompanied by a strong intensification of economism and, quote, primitiveness? Even if a, quote, broad local press could be established at all satisfactorily, and we have shown this to be impossible, save in very exceptional cases. Even then, the local organs could not, quote, gather and organize all the revolutionary forces for a general attack upon the autocracy and for leadership of the united struggle. Let us not forget that we are here discussing only the rallying, organizing significance of the newspaper, and we could put to Nadezhdin, who defends fragmentation, the question he himself has ironically put, quote, have we been left a legacy of 200,000 revolutionary organizers? Furthermore, quote, preparations for demonstrations cannot be contraposed to Iskra's plan for the very reason that this plan includes the organization of the broadest possible demonstrations as one of its aims. The point under discussion is the selection of the practical means. On this point also, Nadezhdin is confused, for he has lost sight of the fact that only forces that are, quote, gathered and organized can, quote, prepare for demonstrations, which hitherto, in the overwhelming majority of cases, have taken place spontaneously, and that we lack precisely the ability to rally and organize. Quote, work among the unemployed. Again, the same confusion, for this too represents one of the field operations of the mobilized forces, and not a plan for mobilizing the forces. The extent to which Nadezhdin here too underestimates the harm caused by our fragmentation, by our lack of 200,000 organizers, can be seen from the fact that many people, including Nadezhdin, have reproached Iskra for the paucity of the news it gives on unemployment and for the casual nature of the correspondence it publishes about the most common affairs of rural life. The reproach is justified, but Iskra is, quote, guilty without sin. We strive, quote, to stretch a line throughout the countryside, too, where there are hardly any bricklayers anywhere, and we are obliged to encourage everyone who informs us, even as regards the most common facts, in the hope that this will increase the number of our contributors in the given field, and will ultimately train us all to select facts that are really the most outstanding. But the material on which we can train is so scanty that, unless we generalize it for the whole of Russia, we shall have very little to train on at all. No doubt, one with at least as much ability as an agitator and as much knowledge of the life of the vagrant as Nadezhdin manifests could render priceless service to the movement by carrying on an agitation among the unemployed. But such a person would be simply hiding his light under a bushel if he failed to inform all comrades in Russia as regards every step he took in his work, so that others who, in the mass, still lack the ability to undertake new kinds of work might learn from his example. All without exception now talk of the importance of unity, of the necessity for, quote, gathering and organizing. But in the majority of cases, what is lacking is a definite idea of where to begin and how to bring about this unity. Probably all will agree that if we unite, say, the district circles in a given town, it will be necessary to have for this purpose common institutions, i.e. not merely the common title of league, but genuinely common work, exchanges of material, experience, and forces, distribution of functions, not only by districts, but through specialization on a town-wide scale. All will agree that a big secret apparatus will not pay its way, to use a commercial expression, quote, with the resources, in both money and manpower, of course, of a single district, and that this narrow field will not provide sufficient scope for a specialist to develop his talents. But the same thing applies to the coordination of activities of a number of towns, since even a specific locality will be, and in the history of our social democratic movement, has proved to be far too narrow a field. We have demonstrated this above in detail with regard to political agitation and organizational work. What we require foremost and imperatively is to broaden the field, establish real contacts between the towns on the basis of regular common work. For fragmentation weighs down on the people, and they are stuck in a hole, to use the expression employed by a correspondent to Iskra, not knowing what is happening in the world, from whom to learn, or how to acquire experience and satisfy their desire to engage in broad activities. I continue to insist that we can start establishing real contacts only with the aid of a common newspaper, as the only regular all-Russia enterprise, one which will summarize the results of the most diverse forms of activity and thereby stimulate people to march forward untiringly along all the innumerable paths leading to revolution, in the same way as all roads lead to Rome. If we do not want unity in name only, we must arrange for all local study circles immediately to assign, say, a fourth of their forces to active work for the common cause, and the newspaper will immediately convey to them the general design, scope, and character of the cause. It'll give them a precise indication of the most keenly felt shortcomings in the all-Russia activity, where agitation is lacking and contacts are weak, and it will point out which little wheels in the vast general mechanism a given study circle might repair or replace with better ones. A study circle that has not yet begun to work, but which is only just seeking activity, could then start, not like a craftsman in an isolated little workshop, unaware of the earlier development in industry, or of the general level of production methods prevailing in industry, but as a participant in an extensive enterprise that reflects the whole general revolutionary attack on the autocracy. The more perfect the finish of each little wheel, and the larger the number of detail workers engaged in the common cause, the closer will our network become, and the less will be the disorder in the ranks consequent on inevitable police raids. The mere function of distributing a newspaper would help to establish actual contacts, if it is a newspaper worthy of the name, i.e. if it is issued regularly, not once a month like a magazine, but at least 4 times a month. At the present time, communication between towns on revolutionary business is an extreme rarity, and at all events is the exception rather than the rule. If we had a newspaper, however, such communication would become the rule, and would secure not only the distribution of the newspaper, of course, but, what is more important, an exchange of experience, of material, of forces, and of resources. Organizational work would immediately acquire much greater scope, and the success of one locality would serve as a standing encouragement to further perfection. It would arouse the desire to utilize the experience gained by comrades working in other parts of the country. Local work would become far richer and more varied than it is at present. Political and economic exposures gathered from all over Russia would provide mental food for workers of all trades and all stages of development. They would provide material and occasion for talks and readings on the most diverse subjects, which would, in addition, be suggested by hints in the legal press, by talk among the people, and by, quote, shamefaced government statements. Every outbreak, every demonstration would be weighed and discussed in its every aspect in all parts of Russia, and would thus stimulate a desire to keep up with and even surpass the others. We socialists do not by any means flatly reject all emulation or all competition, and consciously prepare that which at first, as it were, sprang up spontaneously, a desire to take advantage of the favorable conditions in a given district or at a given moment for modifying the plan of attack, etc. At the same time, this revival of local work would obviate that desperate, convulsive exertion of all efforts and risking of all forces, which every single demonstration or the publication of every single issue of a local newspaper now frequently entails. On the one hand, the police would find it much more difficult to get at the roots if they did not know in what district to dig down for them. On the other hand, regular common work would train our people to adjust the force of a given attack to the strength of the given contingent of the common army. At the present time, hardly anyone ever thinks of doing that, because in 9 cases out of 10, these attacks occur spontaneously. Such regular common work would facilitate the transportation from one place to another, not only of literature, but also of revolutionary forces. In a great many cases, these forces are now being bled white on restricted local work, but under the circumstances we are discussing, it would be possible to transfer a capable agitator or organizer from one end of the country to the other, and the occasion for doing this would constantly arise. Beginning with short journeys on party business at the party's expense, the comrades would become accustomed to being maintained by the party, to becoming professional revolutionaries, and to training themselves as real political leaders. And if indeed we succeeded in reaching the point when all, or at least a considerable majority of the local committees, local groups, and study circles took up active work for the common cause, we could, in the not distant future, establish a weekly newspaper for regular distribution in tens of thousands of copies throughout Russia. This newspaper would become an enormous pair of Smith's Fellows that would fan every spark of the class struggle and of popular indignation into a general conflagration around what is in itself still a very innocuous and very small, but regular and common effort in the full sense of the word. A regular army of tried fighters would systematically gather and receive their training. On the ladders and scaffolding of this general organizational structure, there would soon develop and come to the fore social democratic Zhelyabovs from among our revolutionaries and Russian Babels from among our workers, who would take their place at the head of the mobilized army and rouse the whole people to settle accounts with the shame and the curse of Russia. That is what we should dream of. We should dream. I wrote these words and became alarmed. I imagined myself sitting at a unity conference, and opposite me were the Rabotchaya Dielo editors and contributors. Comrade Martinov rises and, turning to me, says sternly, "Permit me to ask you, has an autonomous editorial board the right to dream without first soliciting the opinion of the party committees?" He's followed by Comrade Khrushchevsky, who, philosophically deepening Comrade Martinov, who long ago rendered Comrade Plekhanov more profound, continues even more sternly. I go further. I ask, has a Marxist any right at all to dream, knowing that according to Marx, mankind always sets itself the tasks it can solve, and that tactics is a process of the growth of party tasks, which grow together with the party? The very thought of these stern questions sends a cold shiver down my spine and makes me wish for nothing but a place to hide in. I shall try to hide behind the back of Pisarev. There are rifts and rifts, wrote Pisarev, of the rift between dreams and reality. My dream may run ahead of the natural march of events, or may fly off at a tangent in a direction in which no natural march of events will ever proceed. In the first case, my dream will not cause any harm. It may even support and augment the energy of the working men. There is nothing in such dreams that would distort or paralyze labor power. On the contrary, if man were completely deprived of the ability to dream in this way, if he could not from time to time run ahead and mentally conceive in an entire and completed picture the product to which his hands are only just beginning to lend shape, then I cannot at all imagine what stimulus there would be to induce man to undertake and complete extensive and strenuous work in the sphere of art, science, and practical endeavor. The rift between dreams and reality causes no harm if only the person dreaming believes seriously in his dream, if he attentively observes life, compares his observations with his castles in the air, and if, generally speaking, he works conscientiously for the achievement of his fantasies. If there is some connection between dreams and life, then all is well, unquote. Of this kind of dreaming, there is unfortunately too little in our movement, and the people most responsible for this are those who boast of their sober views, their closeness to the concrete, the representatives of legal criticism and of illegal tailism. Section 5.3. What type of organization do we require? From what has been said, the reader will see that our tactics, as planned, consists in rejecting an immediate call for assault, and demanding, quote, to lay effective siege to the enemy fortress, or, in other words, in demanding that all efforts be directed towards gathering, organizing, and mobilizing a permanent army. When we ridiculed Rabotchaya Dielo for its leap from economism to shouting for an assault, for which it clamored in April 1901 in Listok Rabotchaya Dielo 157, number 6, it of course came down on us with accusations of being doctrinaire, of failing to understand our revolutionary duty, of calling for caution, etc. Of course, we were not in the least surprised to hear these accusations from those who totally lack principles and who evade all arguments by references to a profound tactics as process, any more than we were surprised by the fact that these charges were repeated by Nadezhdin, who in general has a supreme contempt for durable programs and the fundamentals of tactics. It is said that
Same time tomorrow.